Evening, everyone. This is Pastor Kevin Bunn from Bible Baptist Church here in Burlington, North Carolina. Of course, I'm bringing you walking through the Word tonight with Pastor Lew and Brother Sean Henley and Pastor Quigley. And I enjoy being with you guys each Friday night as we continue to march our way or walking through the Word. We're just marching our way right through the Word of God. Tonight, we'll be dealing with Deuteronomy chapter 11 and chapter 12. There's a lot to get into tonight, so I want to go ahead and dig in. But this is like I like to call it backyard in the Bible. As you can tell, I'm in my backyard here in Gibsonville, and I just enjoy expounding and exemplifying the Word of God tonight and lifting Christ up and my Savior. I'm going to be dealing with a subject on this land is our land and this land is your land. So let's go ahead and dig right into the Word of God tonight. Once again, this is Deuteronomy chapter 11 and chapter 12. Moses once again exhorted the Israelites to be loyal and faithful to God in order to maintain the covenant he established with them. Now Moses said in verse number 1, "Therefore thou shalt love the Lord thy God and keep his charge and his statutes and his judgments and his commandments always." Now, to love the Lord is to obey all his precepts. You can go back and read Deuteronomy 6:5, Deuteronomy 10:12, and Deuteronomy 30:16, and also John chapter 14, verse 15. This love was to be the appropriate response to their God, the one who spared the lives of his people and renewed his covenant relationship with them after they had turned away from him to worship a molten calf, as you remember us studying through Exodus chapter 32 through 34. And also it expounds on it in Deuteronomy chapter 9 and 10, that the Lord demanded total obedience from his people is made explicit by Moses when he used 4 different words: charge, statutes, judgments, and commandments to describe God's covenantal laws. Okay, that's God's covenantal laws. The first term, charge, which is the Hebrew word mismerit, is used here for the first time in Deuteronomy. It refers to a judicial order, an obligation that serves to restrain someone from beginning or continuing to do something that could potentially hurt others. Okay, thus to keep God's charge means to refrain from doing anything that could hurt him. The term statute, which is the Hebrew hukum, refers to something prescribed. As such, it could be translated. You can use the same terminology, prescriptions or decrees. Okay, the term translated as judgments is the Hebrew word mispatum, refers to legal procedures or commands issued by a judge. Okay, the term commandments, which is the Hebrew word mifawah, refers to the laws and rules, that is the whole legal corpus and so on. Moses used these 4 words to encompass all the covenantal legislation that God asked his people Israel to observe. In other words, Moses emphasized, I got my terminology right here, emphasized the totality of God's authority and the importance of obeying the whole decree of God. Moses then specified the audience to whom his message was addressed. He said this in verse number 2, "And know ye this day, for I speak not with your children, which have not known, and which have not seen the chastisement of the Lord your God, his greatness, his mighty hand, and his stretched out arm." See, the generation of Israelites addressed on the plain of Moab was different, from the old generation who escaped from Egypt. The book of Numbers tells us that all the men who, after witnessing God's powerful work in Egypt, rebelled in their unbelief, would not enter the promised land. You can go back and that's in Numbers chapter 14, verses 22 and 23. That judgment specifically applied to those who were 20 years old and upward, except for Caleb and Joshua. Okay, that's Numbers 14, 29 through 30. Thus, the new generation of Israelites assembled on the plain of Moab was composed of those who were under 20 years of age at the time of the Exodus, as well as those who were born during the wilderness wandering. Moses made it clear that his message concerned the Israelites who were under 20 years of age because they had been born in Egypt and had known and seen the discipline of the Lord manifested by his mighty acts. Such a discipline was meant to instruct the Israelites on the proper way of living in a covenant relationship with God. That's Deuteronomy 8:5. The discipline of the Lord, which the Israelites witnessed with their own eyes, pertains to various mighty acts that demonstrate the kind of God that he is, specifically his greatness, his mighty hand, and his outstretched arm. The Lord's mighty hand is a picture of his sovereign power, and his outstretched arm, demonstrating his overwhelming strength, was used to liberate Israel from slavery in Egypt. That's Exodus 6:1 and Deuteronomy 5:34. The Israelites first saw the Lord's power in Egypt. The Lord clearly showed. Now, verses 3 and 4 says this in Deuteronomy chapter 11. And his miracles and his acts, which he did in the midst of Egypt unto Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and unto all his land, and what he did unto the army of Egypt, unto their horses and to their chariots, how he made the water of the Red Sea to overflow them as they pursued after you, and how the Lord hath destroyed them unto this day. This is a reference to the 10 plagues that the Lord performed, and that pertained in the land of Egypt in Exodus 7 through 12. In the book of Exodus, God asked Moses to go to the Pharaoh to request the release of the Israelites from slavery so that they could go in and possess the land promised to them. That's Exodus 9:1. Pharaoh refused to listen to God's command. The Lord sent plagues, signs, and wonders in Pharaoh and the Egyptians. And after a 10th plague in which the Lord struck dead all the firstborn of Egypt, Pharaoh and the Egyptians urged the Israelites to go out of Egypt in haste. Like, get out of the land. Get out of the land. Now, you got to remember when God was doing all of these things, that God was telling them, listen, I done had enough of what you're doing in Egypt. I've had enough of the oppression of my people. And when God says enough is enough, enough is enough. And so, listen, by the time we got to the 10th plague, God, the whole Egyptian army, the people that was there, and even Pharaoh himself said, look, I done had enough. Y'all get out in haste. And they were saying, we'll all be dead if the Israelites don't leave, okay? This act demonstrates the sovereign power of Israel's God, who rescued them with a mighty hand and outstretched arm. Moreover, the discipline of the Lord relates to his victory over the Egyptian army. This includes what he did to Egypt's army, to his horses and its chariots, when he made the water of the Red Sea to engulf them while they were pursuing the Israelites, and the Lord completely destroyed them. This event is described in the book of Exodus. In Exodus 14, Pharaoh and his army followed the Israelites after they had agreed to let them go out of the land. Then he brought the Egyptian army into great confusion, okay? Back in Exodus 14:24. After the Israelites successfully crossed the Red Sea, the Egyptian army followed them, and the Lord caused the sea to cover them. So the Lord's signs and works were seen in his dealings with Egypt. This was a reference to the Lord disciplining Israel in the wilderness until they came to this place, meaning the plain of Moab. The Israelites disobeyed their God multiple times during their wilderness wandering and were punished as a result. But one incident is specifically mentioned right here. What he did to Dathan and Abiram when they and others rebelled against Moses, God's anointed leader and covenant mediator. They were the sons of Eliab, the son of Reuben. As described in Numbers 16, the Lord judged them for their rebellion against the authority of Moses when the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them, their households, their tents, and every living thing that followed them among all Israel. Thus Moses asked the Israelites to remember what God did to Dathan and Abiram. Therefore, since the adult Israelites had witnessed with their own eyes all the great work of the Lord, which he did, Moses commanded them to live in a way that pleased God in order to have an enjoyable life in the land of Canaan. He commanded them to be self-governing and treat one another with loving service, which would lead to a community that was safe and prosperous. Moses exhorts the Israelites to keep every commandment of God so that they may be strong to go in and possess the land of Canaan. To encourage the people, Moses contrasts the prosperous land of Canaan, which depends on God's irrigation, with the land of Egypt, a land whose fertility depends on the exploitation of water from the Nile through human effort. After reminding the Israelites of the mighty acts of God in the past, how he rescued them from Egypt by performing signs and wonders before Pharaoh, and how he dealt with Dathan and Abiram, Moses then exhorted the Israelites to follow God wholeheartedly for what he would do in the future. He said to them in verse number 8, therefore shall you keep all the commandments which I command you this day, that you may be strong and go in and possess the land, whether you go to possess it. The word commandments refers to the whole corpus of ordinances, okay, and statutes of God. Moses' emphasis on every commandment suggests that of the many commandments, not even one was negotiable. Not one. The Israelites were commanded to obey God in every respect. As Moses exhorted the Israelites, he spelled out the purpose of keeping every divine commandment, saying, so that you may be strong and go in and possess the land, and to which you are about to cross to possess it. Now, God wanted each individual, now listen, God wanted each individual Israelite to keep every commandment so that he could provide them with the strength needed to conquer the land of Canaan. Keeping God's commandments would ensure a number of things that would lead to a great teamwork and collaboration. Speaking what is true, wishing the best for others rather than acting in envy, serving the best interests of others rather than exploiting them for selfish gain. Amen to that. Such teamwork would make for a strong fighting force, as well as a wholesome and prosperous community. But besides the strength he would give them to conquer Canaan, keeping every divine commandment leads to longevity, okay, in the land. Moses said in verse number 9, and that ye may prolong your days in the land which the Lord sware unto your fathers to give unto them and to their seed, a land that floweth with milk and honey. The Israelites were to obey the entire commandment of God in order to be blessed with a long life in the land God promised to the patriarchs. This makes it clear that living in the land is a condition to continued blessing. And in order to remain in the land, the people will have to live in obedience to God. If they are not fulfilling their priestly function of demonstrating the superiority of living in a self-governed manner, then God will remove them from the land. The Yahweh is the God who makes lasting promises. He gave the land of Canaan to Abraham and his descendants forever. In Genesis 13:15, he says, for all the land which thou seest, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed forever. Okay? God chose Abraham's descendants, Israel, to be his own possession and a kingdom of priests to represent him on the earth. Okay? Exodus 19:4-6. The Israelites were the ones who would inherit the land. However, in order to live in it and experience the blessings of their possession, they were required to be loyal to God and live in obedience to his commands. Living in the land of Canaan was a special privilege because it was a land flowing with milk and honey, an expression describing the abundance of the land. In other words, Canaan was a prosperous land. God gave an excellent land to his covenant people so that they would enjoy their lives in submission to his will. Nevertheless, failure to submit to God's covenantal laws would deprive Israel from all the benefits of the land because they would either be removed from it or die in it. As Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 19-20. The land was granted to them, but required obedience to enjoy the blessings of the grant. Now listen, Moses contrasted the wealth of Canaan with the land of Egypt. Okay? Now listen to verse number 10 in chapter 11. For the land, whether thou goest in to possess it, is not as the land of Egypt, from whence ye came out, where thou sowest thy seed and waterest with it with thy foot, as a garden of herbs. Their dependence upon God in Canaan will be quite tangible, in that they will have to depend upon rains for their crops. Little rain falls in Egypt each year. So if you do the study on that, very little rainfall falls in Egypt each year. It is a desert whose fertility depends primarily on the exploitation of the water from the Nile through human effort. That is why Moses reminded the people of Israel that they used to sow their seed and water it with their foot when they were in slavery in Egypt. However, this would not be the case for the land of Canaan. As Moses said, but the land where ye go to possess it is a land of hills and valleys and drinking water of the rain of heaven. 11:11. God is the one who would provide irrigation for the land of Canaan through rain and dew. Okay? Canaan, Moses showed, is in verse number 12, a land which the Lord thy God careth for. The eyes of the Lord thy God are always upon it, from the beginning of the year even unto the end of the year. See, the Lord cared much for the land of Canaan because that was the land he promised to give Abraham and his descendants back in Genesis 13:15. Therefore, the land of Canaan was dependent upon God for his irrigation throughout the year. This will make God's continued blessing more tangible, okay, as he will be required to bring the annual rainfall. Moses continued to exhort Israel to covenant loyalty and faithfulness. He clearly spelled out the conditions by which the land of Canaan might continue to yield its natural benefits. In the first part of the conditional statement, Moses said to Israel that, all right, listen, in verse 13, and it shall come to pass, if you shall hearken diligently unto my commandments, which I command you this day, to love the Lord your God, and to serve him with all your heart and with all your soul. That word, the phrase to hearken diligently is the Hebrew word shemor or teshemayu. Literally, this is what it means. If hearing, you will hear. And that's an intense expression that conveys diligent adherence. It's to carefully obey what is said. In this case, the Israelites were to carefully obey God's commandment that Moses pronounced to them. Okay? The commandment Moses had in mind contains two essential principles and is a summary of all the commandments, okay? To love the Lord your God and serve him with all your heart and all your soul. The first principle, to love God, is to live in complete obedience to him. Such a love for God is primarily an expression of obedience to his covenantal laws. This love was to be appropriate response to the Lord because he is Israel's God. The second principle required Israel to serve him with all their heart, with all their soul. The verb serve refers to the act of making offerings to God as a way of paying homage to him. The word heart describes a seat of feeling and of intellect. The word soul refers to the invisible part of man and is the seat of desires and passions. Together, the words heart and soul emphasize complete obedience to Yahweh, the Almighty God. The Israelites were to pay homage to God in complete submission to him in every respect of their lives. This, of course, would lead to prosperous and healthy communities, since most of God's commands involve treating others with respect and love. In response to Israel's faithfulness to the Lord and his covenant with them, the Lord promised to, in verses 14 and 15 of chapter 11 tonight, that I will give you the rain of your land in his due season, the first rain and the latter rain, that thou mayest gather in thy corn and thy wine and thine oil. And I will send grass in thy fields for thy cattle, that thou mayest eat and be full. That's chapter 11, verse 14 and 15. Love for God and faithful devotion to him is his covenant that brings blessings. Moses told the Israelites that God would send the rain from heaven to irrigate the land for the people, and this would be done with no human effort, okay? Unlike in the land of Egypt. The land of Canaan was dependent upon God for rain throughout the entire year, okay? This includes the early rain, or the autumn rain, as they call it. That's between October and November, which brings the dry summer to a close and loosens the soil in preparation for planting, followed by the latter rain, or the spring rain, which is between March and April, which enables the final growth period before gathering or collecting the crops. Such rain, Moses said, will allow the Israelites to gather in their grain and their new wine and their new oil. In addition, God would also provide grass for the animals to eat. Thus, Moses said that the Israelites would eat and be satisfied. Nevertheless, knowing that material possessions and physical comfort could easily lead to self-gratification, okay, and self-seeking stuff, Moses warned Israel against turning away from their Yahweh. He warned them to take heed to yourselves, your heart be not deceived, and ye turn aside and serve other gods and worship them. In verse 16, the verb deceive, which is Hebrew pata, means to allow oneself to be persuaded or misled. It occurs frequently in the book of Proverbs to describe people who are simple or easily led by others. Proverbs 20:19. That is why David says in Psalms 19:7, in the last part of that verse, the testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. Okay? God's word and his commandments make people wise and firm. The verb serve refers to the act of making offerings to God as a way of paying homage to him. Then the verb worship can also be translated as to bow down or to prostrate oneself, okay, or prostrate oneself. The idea is of bowing down before a superior to show reverence to him. The Israelites were prohibited from being deceived or from bowing down before any other than the true God, the living God, Yahweh, as they called him. Such an act would cause Israel to turn away from following the true God, a violation of the very first commandment, thou shalt have no other gods before me, binding the true living God with his people Israel. Now, you can go back and read Exodus 23 and Deuteronomy 5:7, okay? Such an act of disobedience carries its own risk many times. The anger of the Lord is in his righteous judgment. When his people Israel violate the terms of this covenant, he has the absolute authority as God to do whatever he pleases. In this passage in verse 17, God would express his righteous judgment when he would, and this is what verse 17 says in chapter 11, and then the Lord's wrath be kindled against you, and he shut up the heaven, and there will be no rain, and that the land yield not her fruit, unless ye perish quickly from off the good land which the Lord giveth you. As a result, the Israelites would perish quickly from the good land and the land which the Lord has given them. If Israel became disobedient, God reserved the right to take appropriate measures to judge sin and execute the provisions of the covenant, okay, to which Israel had agreed. Israel had agreed to a covenant, okay, whereby they would serve God by serving one another, okay? They swore to live in self-governance, Okay? Loving their neighbor as themselves. They promised to avoid envy and seek the best for others. In this manner, they would create a society filled with benefits beyond measure, brimming with safety and prosperity. This would be their priestly function to other nations. God made it clear that if they did not fulfill each one of these, they would be disciplined appropriately. Moses asked the Israelites to constantly reflect on God's covenantal laws. Deuteronomy 11:18 says this, therefore shall ye lay up these my words in your heart and in your soul. The verb here translated lay up means to put, to set, or to place. In other words, Moses asked the Israelites to place these words on their heart and on their soul. The word heart describes a seat of feeling or of intellect. Okay. The word soul refers to the invisible part of man and is the seat of desires and passions. Together, the words heart and soul emphasize complete, as we've said before, obedience to Yahweh. Moses asked each individual Israelite to constantly reflect on the covenantal principles in order to remain faithful to their God. You can go back and read Joshua 1:8, Psalms 1:2. Just as Moses figuratively spoke, okay, of placing God's commandments on the heart and on the soul, he also spoke of wearing copies of the commandments on the body. This is figurative, of course, way of stressing the importance of these laws. Moses repeats the command from Deuteronomy 6:8 to bind them for a sign upon your hand, that they may be as frontlets between your eyes, right here. The Israelites were to constantly have God's commandments in view and in mind in order to carefully observe them. Such a careful observance of God's laws would demonstrate Israel's genuine love for God and would be public demonstration of their commitment to Him. It would also cause them to live in a self-governed manner, serving one another and creating mutual benefit. This, of course, would lead to a society full of prosperity and safety. Not only did the individual Israelite need to constantly reflect on God's laws, he needed to pass the knowledge to his descendants as well. In other words, the knowledge of God should leave, okay, the individual's private heart to reach his own family in his home. Moses stated that again the people needed in verse 19 of chapter 11, and you shall teach them your children, speaking of them which thou sittest in thine house, and when thou walkest by the way, when thou liest down, and when thou risest up. The piling up of these pairs of contrasting verbs together is a perfect literary device called a merism, okay, is like what they like to call it. That combines two contrasting words to revert to it of all of its entirety, the sentence. According to the contrast between sitting in your house and walking along the road would be an ancient way to say 24/7. It's the best way to put it. You're never to stop doing it. This combination suggests that the teachings was not meant to be a one-time activity. Rather, it would be done on a regular basis. It was to be constant and continual. Okay. Moses also commanded the Israelites to remember God's covenant principles every time they left their homes and came back. He then told the people to write them on the doorposts of their house. Not only did the Israelites need to write these laws on their doorposts, they also needed to write them on their gates. I mean, in a figurative way, okay? It's what the gates refer to the gates of the cities, because in ancient Israel, most houses did not have gates. Moses used the word gate or city gate here because it was the most appropriate place to make public of any matter, since people would constantly pass through it as they traveled back and forth to the city. You can read Ruth chapter 3, verse 11, Proverbs 31:31. Thus, writing God's laws on the doorposts of the houses and on the gates figuratively implies sharing God's laws to the community so that they too could become acquainted to the laws of God. I mean, you didn't know that they had billboards in biblical times. They did. That's what God was saying. I want you to put something out there to where your neighbors can see it, where the people can walk down the street can see it, the people around you can see it. I want you to promote it as much as possible. Doing so would cause Israel to live the way God intended for them to live, as a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. They were to live in a self-governed manner, serving one another to certain mutual benefits. Moses concluded this section of what we're reading tonight, spelling out the purpose for obeying these commandments, okay? He said to Israel that they were to obey the Lord so that your days and your days of your sons may be multiplied on the land which the Lord swore to your fathers to give them as long as the heavens remain above the earth. The verb multiply refers to a numerical growth, okay? A form of blessing that was common in ancient Far East. Okay, the Israelites were promised longevity in the land of Canaan if they would carefully obey the entirety of God's laws. The expression as the days of heaven upon the earth in verse 21 implies permanence, okay? In verse 21 implies permanence. It is a vivid way of saying that if the Israelites walked in obedience, they would have the land forever. If God's people remained faithful to his commandments, they would not be removed from the land of Canaan. God granted the land of Canaan to Abraham's descendants forever. That's Genesis 13:15. This was an unconditional and irrevocable promise, okay? You can go back and read Romans 11:29, and was a reward to Abraham for his faithful service. God chose Abraham's descendants, Israel, to be his own possession. Exodus 19:4-6. And they were the ones who would inherit the land and perpetuity. For however, in order to live and prosper in land required them to honor their covenant with God and walk in obedience. The grant of the land as a reward to Israel's fathers would never fail. But in order to enjoy the benefits of that grant, required carefully obeying God's covenantal laws. The Israelites would lose the privilege of living and remaining in Canaan if they proved unfaithful to their God. Having told the Israelites that the gift of land promised to their fathers would be permanent, Moses now asked the people of God to obey God's laws in order to successfully conquer the land. He stated in verses 22-23 in chapter 11, for if ye shall diligently keep all the commandments which I command you to do them, to love the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, and to cleave unto him, then will the Lord drive out all these nations from before you, and you shall possess greater nations and mightier than yourselves. The word commandments refers to all the ordinances and statutes of God. Some of these things are repeated. Keeping his commandment was summarized by three key principles. Can't speak tonight. Three key principles: to love the Lord, to walk in all his ways, and to hold fast to him. First, the Israelites were commanded to love the Lord their God. To love God is to live in complete obedience to him. Such a love for God is more than just a strong affection for him, okay? It is an expression of obedience to his laws and statutes, okay? This love was to appropriate response. It was appropriate response to the Lord because he is the one who knows what is best for his people. Therefore, he demanded love and loyalty. God promised that if Israel would walk in self-governance with mutual respect and service, they would be blessed. This, of course, does make a lot of sense. Mutual service and cooperation always leads to prosperity. Second, the Israelites were commanded to walk in all God's ways. The term translated as ways is Hebrew derek. Literally means road or path. Okay? However, Moses frequently used it in Deuteronomy to refer to the way the Israelites were to live. That is, in accordance to the laws of God, to honor one another in truth and trust and service, to love others as they wanted to be loved. Thus, to walk in God's ways implies Israel's affirmative response to the covenantal laws of God, manifested by a sense of dynamic and mutual engagement. Such obedience would create a society with little need for policing, okay, and a lot of mutual love, respect, and trust. This would, of course, lead to communities that were both enjoyable as well as safe. Third, the Israelites were asked to cleave to God. To cleave means to cling or to keep close. The verb expresses emotional closeness and loyalty. Moses used the same verb in Genesis 2:24 to explain how a man leaves his parents to be joined to his wife, they twain become one flesh. You can see Deuteronomy 4:4, Deuteronomy 10:20 also. Holding fast or cleaving to God would allow the Israelites to stay away from idolatry or anything that led them away from their God. The way of idols is the way of human exploitation and self-seeking. This was to be strictly avoided. Moses told the Israelites that if they followed these three principles in verse 23 of chapter 11, this is what he said: then will the Lord drive out all these nations from before you, and you shall possess greater nations and mightier than yourselves. Although these nations were greater and mightier than Israel, and the Almighty God would deliver them into the hands of his people so that they could defeat them to occupy their land. Israel was given a unique privilege to be a covenant relationship with the Lord. They were chosen by God to be his own possession among all the peoples of the earth. Because of God's choice of Israel, the people would possess a vast territory. As Moses said in verse 24 of chapter 11, every place whereon the soles of your feet shall tread shall be yours, from the wilderness and from Lebanon, from the river and the river Euphrates, even into the uttermost sea shall your coast be. The expression, every place whereon which the soles of your feet shall tread, likely, listen, refers to this: to the ancient practice of gaining formal title to a land by walking in it and through it. The feet was a symbol of power in the ancient far east and indicated the power to conquer and have dominion. In this case, it means that all the territory over which the Israelites walked was to be theirs. Such a vast territory extends from the wilderness in the south to Lebanon in the north. Lebanon speaks of the inland mountain range. Go back and read Deuteronomy 1:7. And the river Euphrates, is an indication of the northwestern side of the river in northern Syria, the northern border of the land that God promised to his people. As far as the western sea, that is the Mediterranean Sea, by the way, in the west. Moses concludes by declaring that in verse 25, there shall no man be able to stand before you, for the Lord your God shall lay the fear of you and the dread of you upon all the land that ye shall tread upon, as he hath said unto you. The Israelites would be victorious, not because their army was stronger than the enemy's army. Instead, they would conquer the land because the Lord would strike terror upon the inhabitants of Canaan. Israel's God is the great warrior, the one who always fights for his people. This would only be in the case, however, if Israel walked in obedience. This part right here, in these verses, it sums up the lot of stipulations that people have in the book of Deuteronomy, okay? Everything that Moses had said in the preceding chapter pertained to the choice between obedience and disobedience to God. In other words, in this part of Deuteronomy chapter 11, Moses clearly spelled out the conditions of the destiny of the Israelites. Depending on their behavior in the land, he stated, see, I am setting before you today a blessing and a curse. The use of is the Hebrew word. It was the Lord who set up the rules which the people needed to obey. The word today is also here. The word is used almost 100 times in Deuteronomy. It indicates something that is crucial for the people to know and respond to in obedience. The emphasis is upon the present, the current moment, which is the only time obedience is possible. In verses 26 through 28. The term blessing often refers to God's favor upon his children. It is typically linked with material possessions, well-being, and prosperity in the Old Testament, okay? If the people would walk in obedience to God's commands and treat one another with respect, trustworthiness, and service, then God promised their nation would be blessed. Such a blessing would be a large part, a natural consequence of Israel making such a choice. But God promised to add supernatural blessings as well. As such, the people of God will receive the blessing. In verse 27, if you obey the commandments of the Lord your God, which I command you this day. On the other hand, failure to obey God's commandment will result in a curse if ye will not obey the commandments of the Lord your God, but turn aside out of the way which I command you this day to go after other gods, which ye have not known. That's verse 28. In the Old Testament, the word curse often refers to a misfortune or a lack of resources. This would happen if the Israelites failed to follow God's commandments. For Israel to turn aside from God's way is to follow other gods, little g, by the way, with whom they had no experience. This would be a violation of the first commandment, which states, you should have no other gods before me. Okay, that's Exodus 23. These gods did not have any covenant relationship with Israel because God alone redeemed the Israelites from Egypt and made a covenant with them at Mount Sinai in Exodus 19. Thus, following false gods would bring curses upon the people of God. The way of false god included sexual perversion, child sacrifice, and human exploitation. It was a philosophy of self-seeking, fleshly desires. God made it clear that he would discipline such behavior. Of course, in a large part, such behavior is often self-destructive. But God promised to also bring divine discipline as well in verses 29 through 30. Moses commanded the Israelites to have a covenant renewal ceremony when they entered the promised land. This ceremony, and this is verse 29, and it shall come to pass when the Lord thy God have brought thee in unto the land whither thou goest to possess it, that thou shalt put the blessing upon Mount Gerizim and the curse upon Mount Ebal. Mount Gerizim lies to the south of Shechem, and Mount Ebal lies to the north. Shechem was located on the shoulder between the two, on the eastern approach to the modern town of Nablus, okay? According to Deuteronomy 27, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Joseph, and Benjamin, 6 of the tribes, were to stand on Mount Gerizim to bless the people. We'll get to that later, Deuteronomy 27:12. Conversely, Reuben, Gad, Asher, Zebulun, Dan, and Naphtali, the other 6 tribes, were to stand on Mount Ebal for the curse. And that's Deuteronomy 27:13. These 2 mountains were at the base of the Canaanite city named Shechem. Shechem was likely chosen because of its association with Israel's forefathers to God, first appeared and made lasting promises regarding Canaan. In fact, after receiving God's instructions to leave his country, Abram passed through the land as far as the site of Shechem, to the oak of Moriah, and built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him, as Genesis chapter 12. It was there in Shechem also that Isaac settled and bought the piece of land which he had pitched his tent from the hand of the sons of Hamor, Shechem's father, and he built an altar there. Genesis chapter 33. It was there that they buried the bones of Joseph, which the sons of Israel brought up from Egypt, as Joshua chapter 24, verse 32. Thus it seems very appropriate here that the place named Shechem was chosen for the renewal of God's covenantal relationship with his people. Just in case the Israelites would have any doubt regarding the location of Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal, Moses tried to pinpoint their exact location while he was on the plain of Moab, He did this by asking in verse 30, are they not on the other side Jordan by the way where the sun goeth down in the land of the Canaanites, which dwell in the champaign over against Gilgal, as somebody heard Gilgal, beside the plains of Moriah. The phrase, the other side of Jordan by the way toward the sun going down, refers to the land of Canaan west of the Jordan River. More specifically, these mountains were located in the land of the Canaanites who lived in Arabah, opposite of Gilgal, beside the oaks of Moriah. The Arabah refers to the Jordan River. Listen, the Jordan Valley where the Canaanites dwelled, Deuteronomy 1:7, Joshua 8:14, These are lands in that area. I'm just giving you some of the surrounding cities and so on and so on. Gilgal was a place where near Mount Gerizim and Ebal, and was inhabited by Canaanites. The oaks of Moriah, the oaks of Moriah, or the plains, as they call it, the plains of Moriah, which was a bunch of oaks, by the way, were located near Shechem. That's Genesis 12:6 and Joshua 24:26. Moses said to Israel in verse 31, for ye shall pass over Jordan to go in to possess the land which the Lord your God giveth you, and ye shall possess it and dwell therein. Moses told the people they were crossing over the Jordan. This statement served as a motivation, encouragement for the people of God who have been wandering in the wilderness for about 40 years. They as long as I've been alive, for 40 years, they needed to know that they would cross the Jordan River to go in and possess the land the Lord had promised them. Nevertheless, as Israelites would possess the land of Canaan and live in it, they were to obey all God's commandments in order to be blessed. To reinforce this concept, listen, Moses repeated what he said earlier in verse 1 and about what was necessary to receive the Lord's blessings in the land. The people needed, and ye shall observe to do all the statutes and judgments which I set before you this day. That was in verse 32 of chapter 11. God was clear that if Israel was to continue in the land, they were to fulfill their assignment to be a priestly nation, to live in a self-governed manner God had commanded, to love and serve one another, to live in truth and security without envy or guile. In this section that we're reading tonight, Moses commanded the Israelites to destroy all aspects of pagan worship, both where the Canaanite nation served their gods and the things they used in their service or in their servicial worship. This would remove temptation from God's people, Israel, to adopt the wicked cultic practices of the Canaanites and help them follow the self-governing path of loving their neighbor demanded by their worship of the true God. The first verse introduces the discourse here contained in chapters 12 through 26 in Deuteronomy. Moses stated that these are the statutes and judgments which you shall carefully observe. The term statutes is Hebrew hukum, refers to something prescribed by authority. As such, it could be translated, they can still use the same word for that translate as prescriptions or decrees. That's what that word means. The second term translated as judgments is Hebrew mishpatim, refers to a legal procedures or command issued by a judge. When used together, these two terms emphasize the totality of God's authority and the importance of obeying the whole law and decree of God. They were also used to reduce the previous two sections in Deuteronomy 4 and Deuteronomy 5. To obey the Lord, Yahweh, the Israelites, being his people, needed to submit themselves to his authority by obeying all his ordinances. That is why it is important for Moses to emphasize God's supreme authority as Israel's supreme ruler. It was all of these precepts that the Israelites were to carefully observe in the land, which the Lord, the God of their fathers, had given them to possess as long as they lived on the earth. Moses made it clear to the Israelites that the giver of the land was in fact the God of their ancestors. The Bible tells us that Israel's forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who knew the Lord, each built an altar and worshiped the Lord in the promised land. Genesis 13:4, 26:25, and 35:7. Thus, the Israelites were commanded to observe God's commandments, just like their forefathers did, okay? Just like their forefathers did. The grant of the land was made without condition as a reward for Abraham's faithful servant. However, God also told them explicitly that their continued possession of the promised land was conditioned on their continued obedience to his word. This principle echoes throughout the scripture. God gives many gifts, but whether we experience the gift as a blessing, possess the possession, or depends on our choices, okay? Now that they are changing seasons and will move from living in the wilderness to possess the fertile land, they needed to be reminded anew that the covenant still stands, with its blessings for obedience and curses for disobedience. It is appropriate that the first item to be discussed in this part of Deuteronomy concerns the destruction of everything having to do with Canaanite religion. The foundation of the covenant and all resulting life in Israel was the exclusive worship of the Lord. The Lord's covenant demanded people serve one another in love, while pagan religions focused on controlling circumstances and satisfying pleasures. There could be no mixture between the two, not whatsoever. Each of the Canaanite nations had its own religious system with its own set of gods and goddesses. Little g's, by the way. They, of course, were holy and compatible with the exclusive worship of the God of Israel. Their worship included all types of sins, abominations, including incest, bestiality, temple prostitution, and child sacrifice. Go back and read Leviticus 18, 1 through 27. For this reason, Moses commanded the Israelites to destroy all the worship centers in Canaan in order to emulate, or emulate is the best word, I guess, such practices. The Israelites seemed to be vulnerable to paganism. Exodus 32 is an example. So to prevent them from relapsing, they needed to remove all remnants of pagan worship from the promised land. In the context of the holy war, the verb translated here is utterly destroy, refers to what God said he wanted to destroy. It means an act of obedience, okay, to destroy the things that are ungodly or idol worship, okay? In this case, the Israelites were responsible to obey God's command to destroy all the religious sites where the Canaanites served their gods in order to emulate their wicked patterns of worship. Part of this was God's judgment upon the immoral and dehumanizing practices of pagan people. God made clear in Genesis 15 that he was giving the Canaanites time to repent for their judgment, and now their time will fully come to pass. The Canaanites worship their many gods in many places. They worship on the high mountains, on the hills, and under every green tree. In fact, it was a common cultic practice in Canaan to place the shrines, which was religious objects, on the high mountains, on the hills, under leafy trees, a practice the Israelites copied later during their times of apostasy. 1 Kings 14:23, 2 Kings 16:4. This was common in many pagan religions, such as seen with Mount Olympus in Greek mythology. Moses then outlined the specific pagan objects to be destroyed by Israel. Not only were they to destroy the places of pagan worship, they also were to tear down their altars and smash their sacred pillars and burn their all that Asherim stuff idols with fire. This means they needed to eliminate the items used in pagan worship as well as places they were used. The terms altars, sacred pillars, speak of the nation's articles of worship. The altars were structures such as tables plated with precious metal on which people offered food and drink to their gods. The sacred pillars refer to stones, either cut or uncut, that represented a male deity, 2 Kings 3:2, and were perhaps some male fertility symbols, some kind of symbols. These were wooden objects which stood at the worship place. They symbolized the fertility goddess Asherah, goddess of fertility, and wife or sister of El, the highest god in the Canaanite pantheon. Moses further told Israel in Deuteronomy 7:5, but thus shall ye deal with them. You shall destroy their altars, break down their images, and cut down their grove, and burn their graven images with fire. The graven images were the idols made by the Canaanites to represent their gods. The verb break down, which is Hebrew abad, means to ruin or destroy. Thus, to obliterate the name of the gods means to completely erase their names from memory. This was intended to remove any temptation to worship pagan gods or include them in the worship of their Lord. There was not to be anything that resembled paganism in the worship of the Lord. Unfortunately, the Israelites were in constant violation of this command. Shortly after Joshua's death, the Israelites served Baal and continued this practice throughout the 300-year period of the Judges. After that, several kings tolerated, even promoted the worship of Canaanite false gods. Finally, after several hundred years of disobedience to these commands, the Lord tolerated it no longer. The Bible reveals to us that the fall of Samaria and Israel's captivity by the Syrians around 722 BC occurred because of the exact things God told them not to do. So it was that the children of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, which had brought them up out of the land of Egypt from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and had feared other gods and walked the statutes of the heathen whom the Lord had cast out before the children of Israel and of the kings of Israel which they had made. And the children of Israel did secretly those things that were not right against the Lord their God, and they built them high places in all their cities, from the tower of the watchman to the fenced city. And they set them up images and groves of every high hill or under every green tree. Verse 11. And there they burnt incense in all the high places, as did the heathen whom the Lord carried away before them, and wrought wicked things to provoke the Lord to anger. That was 2 Kings 17, 7 through 11. Obedience to the Lord always brings blessings to any people. Okay? Conversely, disobedience to God always brings curses on any people. The point is emphasized again and again throughout the book of Deuteronomy. God made provisions for his people Israel through his covenantal stipulations. He gave specific obligations to the Israelites to follow, so that he might be blameless and in his judgment when they disobeyed him. Psalms 51:4. Moses commanded the Israelites not to worship any other god, to worship any other god other than the true God, the Yahweh. And he said, do not worship any of those little g gods of the Canaanites and any of their places. They were to not act like this toward the Lord. They were not to worship anything that was false besides the Lord thy God. The Canaanites used their idols to manipulate the deities to serve their own desires, fleshly desires. In their minds, they did not serve the gods so much as the gods served them. Their sacrifices and worship were transactions where they got what they wanted, including moral sanction for immorality, by the way. In the book of Exodus, Moses prohibited Israel from worshiping the Canaanite gods, from serving them, from doing. He said in Exodus 23:24, thou shalt not bow down to their gods, nor serve them, nor do after their works, but thou shalt utterly overthrow them. Okay, he's telling them to destroy them and quite break down their images. Instead, the Israelites were to serve the Lord exclusively in order that he might bless them. The blessing would include food and good physical health, but it also would be a natural consequence of having an entire country that obeyed God's command to treat others with respect, care, and neighborly love. Verse 5 begins with a strong but, the word but, which is Hebrew kaim. That's K-I-I-M. But if, or rather. Rather than serve local false god, Moses told the Israelites, but unto you the place which the Lord your God shall choose out of all the tribes to put his name there, even to his habitation shall you seek, and thither thou shalt come. Thus the people could not simply choose to worship the Lord at a location they're choosing, a tree, a high place, etc. They had to approach the Lord where he chose to dwell. This was an important part of the covenant. It emphasized that God is the creator who knows what is best for us, rather than a false God who promised to get what you want, okay, or to give you what you want. Worshippers were to come to God on his terms, to hear his commands, not make their own gods to fit their terms and meet their demands. The people of God needed to make pilgrimage to the place which their God chose to establish his name. Once that place was found, okay, once it was found, then the people of God would go there and present their tithes and offerings to their God. Specifically, people were to bring, in chapter 12, Deuteronomy 12:6, and thither ye shall bring your burnt offerings and your sacrifice and your tithes and heap offerings of your hand and your vows and your freewill offerings and the firstlings of your herds and of your flocks. The burnt offering is the Hebrew olah. It is translated as that which goes up, usually in smoke. The worshiper who brought burnt offerings laid his hands on the animals, a bull, okay, a ram, a goat, pigeons, turtle doves, to declare that the gift belongs to him and that the benefits of the burnt offerings would be his. Go back to Leviticus chapter 1. The worshiper had to offer an animal, of course, without defect. That is, with no physical damage. Leviticus 1:3. This picture Jesus, the ultimate sacrifice, who was without sin. The sacrifices in this scripture means the Hebrew zebah were generally offers of thanksgiving which served to bring fellowship between God and the worshiper. Okay, the tithes were a gift in the form of payment of 10% of any agricultural products, grain, wine, oil. Tithe means 10. The heave offers of the hand can also mean a wave offering, something that is lifted up. It refers to a portion that was held up or offered, set apart from the larger portions and dedicated to support the livelihood of the priest. The vow, okay, the vow. The vow offerings were any offerings made as a payment of a vow. These were promised gifts. The free will offerings were gifts that were not required, which could be which could be any sacrifice, okay? The firstlings of your herd and of your flock refers to the firstborn male oxen, sheep, and goats that the worshiper sacrificed to God, okay? These sacrificing offerings were presented to the Lord for the purpose we've seen here. Moses told the people in verse 7, and there ye shall eat before the Lord your God, and you shall rejoice in all that he put your hand unto, ye and your households wherein the Lord thy God hath blessed thee. The phrase, in all that you put your hand into, means in every outstretching of one's hand. It refers to the fruits of man's labor, okay? In addition to being commanded to enjoy themselves when they came to worship and feast, the Israelites were commanded to rejoice in everything they did, to get joy from the actions and activities. This fits with the covenant requirement to treat others as they wanted to be treated. It's difficult to rejoice in all that you have by God's grace if you live in constant fear of losing life or property, right? That makes sense. But in a self-governed society where people treat one another with respect and goodwill as required by God's law, it makes perfect sense that each Israelite ought to thoroughly enjoy all the blessings that would include each and every activity. The Israelites were commanded to eat the products of their labor with gladness before the Lord. And you shall rejoice before the Lord your God, ye and your sons and your daughters and your men servants and your maid servants and the Levite that was within your gates, for as much as he have no part nor inheritance with you. That's Deuteronomy 12:12. Okay, the Lord commands the people to rejoice and feast as a part of worship. The time of worship was not only to acknowledge and restore their fellowship with their God, it was also for the Israelites to enjoy good food and good company. Then they were to leave that place of worship, and take that attitude with them and all that they have from the Lord. Many of the sacrifices were cooked and eaten by the worshipers. The people were not only accountable to follow God's ways for their own good, they were accountable to enjoy life. The Apostle Paul echoes this teaching, saying that God charged them that are rich in this world, that they be not high-minded, nor trust in uncertain riches, but in the living God who giveth us richly all things to enjoy. That's 1 Timothy 6:17. This fits completely with the overarching theme of God's covenant. It is parental instruction to children to show them how to have the most profitable, enjoyable life, part of which is to avoid self-destructive actions, the proverbial playing in busy streets or putting your finger in a light socket. But God also wants his children to enjoy things that ought to be enjoyable. After encouraging the people of God to seek the Lord at the place which he chose for his dwelling, Moses explained to them how they were to conduct their worship in the land of Canaan. When they settle in the promised land, they were not to do at all what we are doing here today. Every man doing whatever's right in his own eyes. Amen. The phrase, ye shall not do after all the things that you do here this day. Every man whatsoever is right in his own eyes. That's in Deuteronomy 12:8. Clearly, Moses is telling Israel something they should not do that they were doing today, which always raises the question, what were the Israelites doing that particular day that would fit the description of whatever's right in your own eyes, and that Moses is forbidding? The immediate thing I can think of in this passage deals with Moses telling Israel that they should not act like this toward the Lord your God, speaking of worshiping God under every green tree or high mountains or pagan worship. Rather, Israel was commanded to seek the Lord at the place which the Lord your God will choose all the tribes to establish his name there for his dwelling. Moses was instructing Israel to worship in the specific place selected by the Lord. Once they inhabited the promised land, that particular day, at that particular time, the people were gathered to listen to Moses speak the very words recorded in Deuteronomy. They were hearing the word of God before it was committed into writing, so to speak. They were on the east side of the Jordan River, camped at Moab. Deuteronomy 1:1-5. Moses was speaking the text of Deuteronomy directly to them, and they were gathered to hear him. They likely gathered a place that was most convenient, okay? Perhaps under the shade of some trees or maybe in an elevated place. This would be efficient and helpful for the purpose of listening to Moses. It would be right in their own eyes, meaning it makes sense for the convenience of the moment. They are listening to Moses give a lengthy speech. Deuteronomy has about 28,000 words. Assuming Moses spoke at a rate of 124 words per minute, his speech would approach 4 hours. And we know people have a problem listening to a 20-minute sermon. You can only imagine listening to 4 hours. So it would make sense for each person to seek a place where it would most convenient to hear his speech. That was not how they were to worship God once they entered the land. They were not to seek out the place of the most convenience, like every green tree. They were to go to a specific spot within Israel, the place God would select. Worshiping God was not to be a matter of convenience. Whatever was right in their own eyes. Moses is emphasizing the point already made, using illustration of the folks gathered around listening to his speech, okay? There is a time to seek that which is most convenient. It was fine for them to do this while listening to Moses. Moses is making the point that worshiping God in the promised land will be different. They are to follow his commands rather than seek convenience, and to worship at the place he will direct from the time the Israelites departed Egypt until they arrived in the plain of Moab. The sanctuary containing the Ark of the Covenant had been portable. It had been moved around in Exodus 25:8. The Israelites had been offering sacrifice to God anywhere they wanted to. But what was permitted during Israel's time of transition was not supposed to be regarded as a lasting permanency, okay, or norm for them. The Israelites worshiped in various places because they had, for you, in verse number 9 of Deuteronomy 12, for ye are not as yet come to the rest and to the inheritance, which the Lord your God giveth you. Once in Canaan, the people of God would cease to worship in various places, and they were not to adopt the pagan practices of worshiping at places of their choosing, what was right in their own eyes, okay? They would worship their God in one specific place, the place where he chose. All of this would change when the Israelites, in verse number 10 of chapter 12, but when you go over Jordan, dwell in the land which the Lord your God giveth you to inherit, and when he giveth you rest from all your enemies round about, so that ye dwell in safety, as he had done many times before in Deuteronomy 3:28. For example, the Lord would fulfill his promise by giving his covenant people the land of Canaan, their inheritance. The change would be that in verse number 11, then there shall be a place which the Lord your God shall choose to cause his name to dwell there. Thither shall ye bring all that I command you, your burnt offerings, and your sacrifice, your tithes, and the heave offering of your hand, and all your choice vows which ye vow unto the Lord. The people, instead of bringing gifts and offerings to a portable tabernacle, they would bring them where the Lord would choose to dwell amongst his people. Also, they would know what to bring because the Lord would tell them. One of the things God will command them to bring will be burnt offerings, okay? The Hebrew word for burnt offerings is olah. It's literally translated as that which goes up, usually in smoke. The worshiper who brought the offerings laid his hands on the animals to declare that the gift belongs to him and that the benefits of the burnt offerings would be his. Leviticus 1. The worshiper had to offer an animal without defect, that is, with no physical damage. This is a picture of the ultimate sacrifice of Jesus, who was without sin and died for the sins of the world. 1 Peter 2:22. There were several other items God would command Israel to bring to his designated place of worship. The sacrifices, which is zebah, the offerings of thanksgiving. They were between God and the worshiper. The tithes, okay, were a gift in form of payment. The heave offerings, they refers to portions that set apart for larger portions. The vow offerings, these were offerings made as payment of a vow, okay. The initial permanent location of the tabernacle will be in Shiloh. Israel's time of peace and security, okay, would occur under Joshua's leadership since Moses did not enter the promised land. The book of Joshua tells us that after Israel's conquest of the land of Canaan, they erected the tabernacle in Shiloh, a site in Ephraim. All right. In Joshua 18:1, it says, and the whole congregation of the children of Israel assembled together at Shiloh and set up the tabernacle of the congregation there. And the land was subdued before them. That's Joshua 18:1. The tabernacle of God remained at Shiloh from about 1350 to 1100 BC until Shiloh was destroyed and the ark was captured by the Philistines in 1 Samuel 4:11. Then the tabernacle moved to other places, 1 Samuel 4:6, 1 Chronicles 16:39. Eventually, the tabernacle of Moses was replaced by a tent built by David on Mount Zion in Jerusalem, where he placed the ark, 2 Samuel 6:16-19, and then by the temple of Solomon, 1 Kings 6:1. Jerusalem remained the chosen site for corporate sacrificial worship until the fall of Jerusalem and around 586 BC. You can read that in 2 Kings chapter 25. Moses told the people they were gathered before the Lord at the tabernacle, that they would, in verse number 12, and you shall rejoice before the Lord your God, ye and your sons and your daughters and your manservants and your maidservants, and the Levite that is within your gates, for as much as he hath no part nor inheritance with you. As can be seen here, the celebration and rejoicing included every one in a person's household. The worship of God had solemn aspects, but it was to be time of fun and fellowship, a time of family gladness, perhaps similar to our Thanksgiving holiday, so to speak. Part of the sacrifice was to be eaten with festive rejoicing. It also was to include the Levite who was within your gates. The Levites had a specific role in Israel. That is caring for the tabernacle in its context and assisting priests in worship in the tabernacle. They lived on the offering and sacrifices, okay, that people brought. All this was to be done with rejoicing in their hearts. The Levites had been told earlier that they were not going to have an inheritance, such as land in the promised land, like the other tribes, Deuteronomy 10:9. They were given 48 specific cities to live in, scattered among the other tribal territories, okay? This was because they were set aside for the service of the Lord. As a result, Israelites and the other tribes were to support the Levites, okay, through their offerings. So Moses commanded Israel to take heed to thyself that thou offer not thy burnt offerings in every place that thou seest. A word that I'm looking for here is cultic. It's not in the Hebrew text, but it can have the same meaning here. In verse 2, the word places refers to the locations where the Canaanites worship their pagan gods and goddesses, okay? These were cultic-like worship. This is probably the case in all of these verses. The Lord does not want his people to worship, celebrate, and rejoice in places that were dedicated to other gods. This included high mountains, hills, and every green tree, Deuteronomy 12:2. Instead, the Israelites were to worship in the place where the Lord chose for them, their tribes. They were to worship him, and only in the places he specified, where the Lord chose. But in the place which the Lord shall choose in one of thy tribes, there thou shalt offer thy burnt offerings, and there thou shalt do all that I command thee. That's in verse 14. The Lord wants obedience from his people. They did not have to guess as to how to worship him. To worship the pagan deities was to embrace self-seeking with its child sacrifice and immorality. Each person bribed the false god to get their way. The true God demanded his people to stay far from such paganism and worship only him. Only in this way could Israel be a place filled with self-governing people who sought to love their neighbor as themselves. Moses then discussed the slaughter of animals that were not used in sacrifice. He told them in the next verse, notwithstanding thou mayest kill and eat flesh in thy gates, whatsoever thy soul lusteth after, according to the blessing of the Lord thy God, which he hath given thee, the unclean and the clean may eat thereof, as of the roebuck and of the hart. That's the deer and the gazelle, so to speak. This was a major policy change for Israel. During the Exodus, animals could be slaughtered only at the tabernacle door. Leviticus 17. This practice worked well when the Israelites dwelt near a religious site, such as when they camped around the tabernacle in the wilderness. However, such a practice would be difficult, even impossible, okay, in the promised land, since some people would live far from central sanctuary, which the Lord chose in verses 20 through 22. Therefore, Moses allowed the Israelites, okay, he allowed the Israelites to slaughter and eat animals within their gates. This was based on the provision of the Lord. The Lord has specified what was clean. It was those foods God had given. But within that category, they could eat whatever they chose. Moses made it clear to the Israelites that the act of slaughtering animals at home would not part of their prescribed ceremonial worship. As such, there was no need to limit the slaughter of animals for food to a place where God would choose. The Israelites could slaughter animals for food within any of their gates, okay, any of their gates. The phrase, as of the roebuck and of the hart, means the Israelites were allowed to eat from the herds and flocks the same as they could eat of the roebuck and the hart. The roebuck and hart were wild animals and were acceptable to eat under the law, okay? He went on to say, only you shall not eat the blood, you shall pour it upon the earth as water. That's in Leviticus 17. That's referring to Leviticus 17. God gave the reasons why the blood of animals were not to be eaten, because the life of all flesh is in the blood. The Lord prohibited eating the blood, since blood symbolized life. It belonged to the life giver, God himself. It was not to be shed nor consumed by humans. All right, in verse 17, thou mayest not eat within thy gates tithe of thy corn, of thy wine, of thine oil, of firstlings of thy herds and thy flocks, nor any of the vows which thou vowest, nor thy freewill offerings, or heave offerings of thy hand. There was to be strict separation between what was offered unto the Lord and consumed as a part of worship, and was consumed in the home or daily sustenance. Okay, let's go on. But thou must eat them before the Lord thy God in the place which the Lord thy God shall choose, thou and thy son and daughter, and thy manservant, maidservant, and the Levite that is within thy gates. And thou shalt rejoice before the Lord thy God in all that thou puttest thine hands unto. That's verse 18 of chapter 12. Moses told that the meal included your son, your daughter, your male and female servants. In other words, everyone in the household was to eat the offerings together in the Lord's presence. Okay. The household celebration was to include the Levite who was in the gates. This was because the Levites depended upon the tithes, offerings, and dues of the other tribes for their livelihood. Okay. Moses reminded the Israelites of their responsibility to provide for the Levites since he has no portion of it or inheritance with them. All right. Verse 18. The last part of verse 18, and thou shalt rejoice before the Lord thy God in all that thou puttest thy hands unto. The phrase means, and the every outstretching of one's hand. It refers to the first fruits of your labor. Okay. Verse 19, take heed to thyself, thou forsake not the Levite as long as thou livest on earth. This repetition was designed to impress upon the people how important it was to support the Levites who ministered before the Lord. Verse 20, when the Lord thy God shall enlarge thy border as he hath promised thee, and shalt thou say, I will eat flesh, because thy soul longeth to eat flesh, that thou mayst eat flesh, whatsoever thy soul lusteth after. This was said earlier in verse 15. The principle here was that the Lord expands the borders of the promised land. His people could possibly live a long way from where the Lord chose for corporate worship, okay? So a person was now permitted to slaughter and prepare meat in the house whenever they wished without having to bring it to the tabernacle as was required during the Exodus. Now, verse 21, in the place which the Lord thy God hath chosen to put his name, there to be far from thee, that thou shalt kill of thy herd and thy flock, which the Lord hath given thee, as I've commanded thee, and thou shalt eat in the gates whatsoever thy soul lust after. Moses told the Israelites who were too far from their designated place of worship to eat the meat of the herd and flock, just as the heart or a roebuck is eaten. Verse 22, even as the roebuck heart is eaten, so thou shalt eat them. The unclean and the clean shall eat of them alike. The hart and roebuck were wild animals, as I mentioned before, and the law allowed the people to consume them for normal meals. They were allowed to eat herd and flock animals. All right, moving right along. 25, then thou shalt not eat of it, that it may go well with thee and with thy children after thee, when thou shalt do that which is right in the sight of the Lord. Have an outline to the Israelites concerning the slaughter of their domestic animals within their gates, with their when their central sanctuary is too far away. Moses now turns to the rules concerning the holy things and the vow offerings that are brought to the central sanctuary, which will be located at the place of his choosing. Moses told the people that only thy holy things which thou hast and thy vows thou shalt take and go into the place which the Lord shall choose. It's verse 26. The word translated only is the Hebrew word rak, and means however or nevertheless. This is a contrast emphasizing between the prescribed holy things, such as their offerings, and their normal daily routines, such as slaughtering and eating meat for the daily menu. The term holy thing refers to that which is sacred and dedicated to God. The word holy is the Hebrew word kadosh, describes that which is set apart for a specific purpose. Here it refers to that which was set apart to sacrifice to the Lord, okay? And verse 27, and thou shalt offer the burnt offerings and the flesh and the blood, and upon the altar of thy God, and blood of thy sacrifice shall be poured out upon the altar of the Lord thy God, and thou shalt eat the flesh. Again, the emphasis is the distinction between that which would be done at home and that which was to be done in the place God would choose for ceremonial worship. Verse 28, observe and hear all the things which I command thee, that it may go well with thee, and with thy children after thee forever, when thou doest that which is good and right in the sight of the Lord thy God. The verb translated here is Hebrew shamar, describes both the mental activity of hearing as well as responding to what was heard. Not only hearing it, but doing it. Okay? By responding in obedience, honoring God's precepts will guarantee well-being for the Israelites and their descendants. Verse 29, when the Lord thy God shall cut off the nations from before thee, whether thou goest to possess them, and thou succeedest them and dwellest in the land. This means that what was said here about Israel taking the land was guaranteed to occur. It would come to pass when the Lord was going to cut off the nation for the Israelites. The verb cut off in the context means to destroy. God was the one who would destroy the Canaanites in order to make room for his people Israel. This destruction would also accomplish the Lord's judgment upon the wickedness of these nations. Okay? In verse 30, Moses urged the Israelites this: take heed to thyself that thou be not snared by following them after they have destroyed from before thee, that thou inquire not after their gods, saying, how did these nations serve their gods? Even so will I do likewise. The word take heed is the Hebrew shamar. Literally means watch or keep guard over. Moses was exhorting the people to examine everything they do, so as not to allow any pagan influence to seep into their worship of the Lord and their treatment of one another. To ensnare literally means to trap, to snare. It means to trap them into breaking the Lord's commandment to love and serve him, as well as loving one another as they love themselves, as you can read about in Leviticus 19:18. Moving right on, verse 31, thou shalt not do so unto the Lord thy God, for every abomination to the Lord which he hateth, have they done unto their gods, for even their sons and their daughters they have burnt in the fire to their gods. These pagan practices have no place in worship of the true God. God commands to love your neighbor as yourself. Can't be mixed with a little bit of abuse or lying or stealing or property. It cannot. It's no mixture. The choice is binary. It's one or the other. The word abomination, Hebrew toba. The term abomination refers to a repugnant or detestable act ranging from defective sacrifices. Once again, he reiterated here in these verses, thou shalt have no other gods before thee. We learned that King Ahaz walked in the way of the kings of Israel, even made his son pass through the fire according to the abomination of the nation whom the Lord had driven out from before the sons of Israel. You go back and read 2 Kings 16:3 and 17:70. God judged Israel for the disobedience when they were defeated by Assyria in 2 Kings 17. It is interesting. Now I'm finishing up. It is interesting that Moses begins and ends this chapter with strong warnings against allowing any amount of paganism to remain in the land where the Lord would dwell. This is in harmony with the first of the 10 commandments. The Lord did not and still does not want anything associated with pagan practices to be identified with him or the worship. He said, those that worship me must worship me in spirit and in truth. If it is a false God, it is false. It is wrong. It is not right. That is why it's better to worship only the one and true living God. Thank you for your time tonight. May God bless you. I appreciate you tuning in to Cross Crusaders tonight and walking through the Word. Once again, this is Pastor Kevin Bunn. Thank you guys for tuning in and watching us tonight.